Egypt's 1973 crossing of the Suez Canal is often presented as a classic lesson in "don't underestimate your enemy," a lesson the surrounding Arab nations had learned several years prior during the Six-Day War. Since that 1967 blowout when Israel had gained full control of the Sinai, Israel had maintained an attitude of military superiority. Israel had constructed the Bar Lev Line, a massive fortification along the eastern bank of the Suez Canal. It consisted of 33 manned forts, with the side facing the canal being a 70-foot-tall sand embankment. Israeli engineers estimated it would take 12 hours to blast through this, meaning they would always have ample warning of any ground invasion. They had been enjoying air supremacy for years. Because of all this, Israel felt comfortable sending a great number of their soldiers home for the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur. Half of the 33 forts were left unmanned. On the night of October 5th, an Egyptian double agent warned Israel of an impending invasion. Unfortunately for them, he said the invasion would be coming at 6 p.m. On October 6th at 2 p.m., Egypt began a 20-minute aerial and artillery bombardment of the Bar Lev Line, loosing 10,000 shells on it in the first 60 seconds. When the remaining 600 Israeli defenders lifted their heads, they saw 100,000 Egyptian soldiers approaching them from across the canal. Using rafts and rope ladders, Egyptian tank hunters then crossed the border. Squads of 10 armed with anti-tank missiles pushed a kilometer beyond the line as Egyptian artillery shifted to deeper targets. Egyptian engineers had determined that under non-combat conditions it would require one bulldozer, 60 men, 600 pounds of explosive, and 8 hours to punch one hole through the wall. The ingenious solution ended up being hydraulic mining. Egyptian rafts would cross with high-volume water pumps. 5 pumps combined could clear the same passage in 2 hours. Israel had a system of underwater pipes that should have allowed them to flood the canal with fuel oil and set it on fire, but Egyptian engineers had found and plugged the pipes the night before. Under the cover of smoke, 4,000 Egyptian infantry crossed the canal, including engineers who would dismantle the Israeli defenses and commandos tasked with destroying artillery batteries and command centers. The Egyptian Air Force had also made good use of anti-radiation missiles, taking out a significant portion of Israeli air defenses, but they faced so many losses that future raids were called off. At 2:35 p.m., the Egyptian flag was raised over the eastern bank of the canal. Israeli reinforcements were coming, but had been successfully bottlenecked by advanced Egyptian units. 10 minutes later, the second wave landed, and Egyptian troops began crossing the canal at will. An hour after that, the first Israeli fort surrendered. Egyptian engineers began work on the wall, with the first breach being opened in less than an hour. 5 bridgeheads were quickly established, and 2.5 hours after the initial artillery barrage, Egypt had over 23,000 soldiers on the far side of the canal. As dusk fell, Egyptian paratroopers were inserted deep into the Sinai. By the following morning, Egypt had opened 60 breaches in the line, but only maintained a dozen bridges, constantly moving them from breach to breach to avoid Israeli airstrike. By now, Egypt had 50,000 men and 400 tanks on the far side, so they dug in and waited for the counterattack. So far, they'd lost 238 men and 20 tanks, while destroying 200 Israeli tanks. Israel constructed their own defensive line 30 kilometers behind the canal. For a moment, it appeared that Israel had begun successfully destroying the Egyptian bridges, but they turned out to be decoys. The Israeli counterattack didn't come for 2 days, and they constantly allowed their forces to be baited into ambushes and destroyed. By repelling a division-sized counterattack on October 8th and establishing bridgeheads on the east bank to a depth of around 15 kilometers, the Egyptians had accomplished the objectives of Operation Badr. Believing that Israel would be quickly victorious, the U.S. had pressured the UN to delay ceasefire talks for a couple days. On October 9th, when they learned that Israel had already lost 400 tanks, the U.S. began to get involved. Israel's military response to this invasion was handled so badly, both through incompetence and military commanders disobeying orders, that it became known as the Makdal, or the blunder. The war lasted 19 days, involving the militaries of Israel, Egypt, and Syria, also expeditionary forces from Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Jordan, Iraq, Libya, Kuwait, Tunisia, Morocco, Cuba, and North Korea. Prior to the 1967 Six-Day War, Sinai had belonged to Egypt and the Golan Heights had belonged to Syria. The ultimate goal of the 1973 Yom Kippur War was the recovery of both. Sadat was not looking for a total military victory, but he needed the military narrative to change as a way of altering the diplomatic landscape. The hallmark of the Arab-Israeli conflict so far had been marked with total Israeli military domination at every turn. As a result, Israel was absolutely unwilling to negotiate with her neighbors, and why would she? War is a failure of diplomacy, and if you know that you can win the war, why bother with the diplomacy? The total Egyptian objective was to retake the Suez Canal, establish secured bridgeheads 15 kilometers into the Sinai, and repel a serious counterattack, and that's exactly what they did. The Israeli Air Force was being mitigated by Soviet air defense systems on the Egyptian side of the canal, so 15 kilometers was as far as they could push before leaving the protective umbrella. And from Sadat's side, it absolutely worked. It just required a lot of patience. On October 6th, the fighting had commenced on two fronts, with Egypt coming across the canal and Syria pushing into the Golan Heights. After the first 3 days, Syrian forces had been pushed back to their original lines, and the Egyptian advance had halted about 15 kilometers into the Sinai. Israel then launched a 4-day counteroffensive against Syria, and within a week, Israeli artillery was within range of Damascus. Israel halted their advance, fearing Soviet intervention. By October 17th, Israel had begun pulling troops away from the Syrian conflict in order to reinforce the Sinai. On the Sinai front, concentrated airstrikes and commando raids had slowly eaten away at the Egyptian air defenses, and the combined air and ground war was slowly pushing Egyptian forces back. Rather than pushing against the entire Egyptian line, an eventual Israeli spearhead, covered by a diversionary attack, was able to infiltrate a parachute brigade across the river, which was able to capture a couple bridge crossings, bringing Israeli tanks to the far side. When Egyptian forces still in the Sinai tried a pincer maneuver to cut the spear, it failed, with one side of the pincer being completely annihilated. Ariel Sharon's armored columns began punching a significant hole in the Egyptian anti-aircraft batteries, establishing a bridgehead into the Egyptian mainland. With this open corridor across the canal, Israeli armor began concentrating on the Egyptian side, preparing for a breakout towards Cairo. Israeli hunter-killer teams still spread through the desert, decommissioning Egyptian SAM sites. The Israeli armor eventually successfully broke out to the south, cutting the bridges behind a portion of the Egyptian army still in Sinai, leaving them totally surrounded. Israeli forces had reached the port of Suez by the time the US-Soviet ceasefire actually went into effect. Even though Israel was able to push Arab forces back to their pre-October 6 borders, the Arab successes and Israeli failures absolutely shocked the Israeli people and inspired the Egyptian people in particular. The ultimate result of this particular conflict was bringing both sides to the negotiating table. On October 5, 1973, Israel had been secure in the idea that they could always take anything they wanted by force, and Egypt had felt they'd been embarrassed repeatedly on an international stage. This war effectively erased both of those sentiments. So here's where we end up once everybody's officially stopped shooting at each other. On this map, white is the territory Israel held prior to the Six-Day War. The light blue is the territory Israel held after the Six-Day War. That's where we were when the Yom Kippur War started. At the end of the Yom Kippur War, the white and light blue remains unchanged, but we see these green areas where Israel is indisputably holding foreign territory, and these red areas where Egypt is still holding parts of the Sinai. By January the following year, an armistice had been hammered out, returning full control of both sides of the canal to Egypt, with a UN-administrated buffer zone between Egyptian and Israeli-held Sinai, and in 1975, the UN buffer became Egyptian territory, with the buffer moving farther to the east. Egypt also began allowing Israeli non-military ships to pass through the canal, and the United States was allowed to start reinstalling early warning systems in the area. In 1979, the Egypt-Israel peace treaty saw Israel retreating even farther, until 1982, when our current international border was finally drawn. The signatories of the peace treaty, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, shared the Nobel Peace Prize in 1978, and in 1981, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat paid for the peace treaty with his life when he was assassinated by Khalid al-Islam Bouli, who explicitly stated that the signing of this treaty was his main motivation. I've covered the assassination in detail over here.